Hello and welcome to this chess strategy review video where I've picked some of the best players of all time and we go over their games to see how they use strategy to their advantage and what we can learn from it. So today I have two former world chess champions playing against one another. In 1964, Mikhail Botvinnik is playing against Vasily Smyslov, and let's see what happens here. Botvinnik wins, because that he wins, let's see how he did it and see if maybe you can figure out what he's attempting to do when it comes to strategy here. So the opening moves are c4, so we have the English opening, and it's the response is knight to f6, and this is a good flexible move. As far as strategy, often you want to control the center, and there's different ways to do that. You can place the pawns in the center, or like this pawn, a flank pawn which attacks one of the valuable central squares. You could also fianchetto a bishop at any point, where that aims through the center. But definitely a good piece of strategy is to control the center. And in this English opening, there can often be a battle for this very valuable d5 square. So that could be a reason the knight jumps in there to cover that square, which is already under attack by the pawn. So the game continues with the knight jumping up here to c3 to add more pressure to that square. And this is a good piece of strategy where you push your c-pawn forward and then bring the knight in behind it. Whereas, if you played knight to c3 before you push that c-pawn, it kind of blocks the pawn, and the pawn can't help in this battle for the center. So we have a good counterattacking move. While white is targeting the d5 square, this e5 pawn push targets the d4 square. And it gains some space in the center. So the game continues with g3, indicating that white wants to fianchetto the bishop and add yet another attacker to that d5 square. So the game continues with bishop to b4. And what's the idea behind this? Well, generally, as far as strategy, you want to bring knights out before bishops. But the more you play, you'll learn when there's exceptions to the general rules and guidelines. Like this, we have the knight covering that d5 square. So maybe the bishop wants to target the knight and try and knock that out. So bishop develops, and now we have castling by black. So another good piece of strategy is to castle early and often. Usually when you castle like this, you can only be, well, I should say pretty much always when you castle, you can only be attacked from head on or from one side. Nothing can come from, off the board towards the king from the other side. Whereas if the king is in the middle, you can be attacked from three different directions. And so the king can be more vulnerable when it's left in the center. So now we have an immediate pawn push here, targeting the bishop, asking the question, what is that bishop doing there? Is it going to retreat or take the knight? So of course it does take the knight, and the computer likes that move, saying that black actually has an edge at this point. So interesting. A general piece of strategy is to not give up your bishop pair unless you have a good reason. So once this bishop is captured, strategy-wise, we see that white will have an advantage of the bishop pair. He has this dark squared bishop that black no longer has, so he can put more pressure on the dark squares, whereas black doesn't have a bishop to counter that. So the person with the extra bishop, it kind of favors them for attacking, because they can try and use that bishop to attack the dark squares, and it'll be harder for the opponent to counter that since his bishop's gone. All right, general strategy tip says don't move a piece or a pawn twice in the opening, but that rule is broken here. The pawn is pushed forward. It does gain more space. It kind of limits the scope of the bishop. So let's see how things continue. And what could have been played that might have been better? The computer recommends rook to e8, just developing the rook behind the pawn that has been pushed forward. So rooks generally belong behind pawns, whether it's a passed pawn, a pawn you plan to push forward, or even an enemy pawn. You can get behind it to target it. All right, so the knight develops here because where else was it going to go? It can't, of course, go here or the pawn would capture it. So that might be another reason why that pawn pushed forward. So the knight moves to the edge of the board here, and white can get ready to castle. Rook finally moves to the center, and the game continues with white castling. We have d6 being played. The computer preferred h6, maybe with the idea of keeping this bishop out of g5 in the future, or maybe even wanting to push forward here and target the knight, which would be kind of trapped in here. So the knight jumps towards the center, and that old saying, a knight on the rim is dim. You definitely want to keep your knights towards the center because they can cover a lot more squares as opposed to the side where they're limited on the number of squares they can attack or move to. So now both players will attempt to complete their development. General strategy is to get all your pieces developed off the back rank as fast as you can, except maybe the king, of course, but the game continues with the best move being found. We have a flank pawn, this f pawn, pushing forward, attacking the more valuable central pawn. And so the game continues with that pawn just pushing forward here, avoiding the trade with the flank pawn, just jumping forward, gaining more space, targeting the central pawn. So an obvious move might be to just go ahead and capture there because the bishop would be backing that up. And that's the second recommended move. Apparently d3 is better. So that is found by the former world champion Botvinnik. And why was this move played instead? Well, if he would have gone ahead and captured this pawn on e3, yes, he'd be up a pawn, but then he'd have these two terrible isolated pawns over here on the queen side, and they'd be doubled as well. And he already has this weak isolated pawn here, so it would just kind of cause more harm to his pawn structure. So the game continues with bishop fianchettoing, aiming down here towards the king side and helping cover the center. And the game continues with the queen stepping over. And what is the point of this? Well, we'll have to see if we can figure it out as the game goes on. It looks like a4 might have been a better move according to the computer. But the game continues with knight developing. And another good piece of strategy is to place your knights. Now, generally, they're almost always good on knight to f6 or c6 for black, c3, and f3 for white. But sometimes you want to develop one knight and then bring the other knight in where it can reinforce that first knight. The same way rooks kind of work together in tandem when they can both grab a open file or a rank. So the game continues with this g4 pawn push and inaccuracy according to the computer, but the game is still pretty much even. Maybe black has a slight edge here. The computer preferred bishop to h3, kind of grabbing this open diagonal, targeting the knight. But general strategy says that you don't want to get rid of a fianchettoed bishop especially in front of your king, or it can create weaknesses on those squares that that bishop was covering. So now we have h6. The best move is found. That prevents this pawn from pushing forward and harassing the knight, which also, I believe, would have trapped that knight as well if this pawn didn't push forward. Okay, so white pushes another pawn, trying to gain space on the king side. And the preferred move would have been queen to g3, according to the computer, kind of lining up on the king. And, excuse me, that's a good strategy, is to take a less valuable piece and line it up on the more valuable piece. Even though there might be pawns and pieces in between, you never know when the position will open up, leading to a discovered attack. So the knight drops back, and now we have the queen, in fact, moving to g3, lining up on the king now. So the game continues with knight that has repositioned. So once you move a knight to the edge of the board, it's usually good to get that back into the game as quickly as possible. And so now black, with the cramped position, might be trying to trade off some material. And that can be a good strategy. If you have less space than your opponent, then sometimes you can trade off some pieces to give your remaining pieces more breathing room. So the game continues with knight moving to h3, avoiding that trade. So likewise, if you are the side with more space, you might want to avoid trading pieces off. Keep your opponent's position cramped and avoid trading pieces, because if you have your pawns pushed further forward and you trade off pieces, it might be harder to cover the holes in your position from those pawns being further forward. All right, so the knight drops back, and now we have h5 targeting the knight on g6. So that knight steps forward. This is an interesting move, and apparently it's the best move. The game is still even, but black has a slight edge here. Of course, the queen is guarding that knight, but why did the knight move here? Well, it's targeting this bishop, which is an important defender around white's king. So, of course, that bishop drops back, and white maintains the bishop pair and avoids giving up that good defensive bishop. So now we have f5 being played, trying to open things up on the king side in front of white's king. That move is ignored, but that was a mistake. Apparently, the computer liked a4. This developing move, how good of a move is that? It does aim up towards black's king side, but at the moment, this pawn is really blocking that bishop in. So the game continues with the queen lining itself up on the bishop, and we saw that that can be a good thing for you to do, to line up the less valuable bishop on a more valuable queen. And generally, you don't want to throw your queen on a diagonal that could open up in the future with a discovered attack. And so the computer says that's a mistake, and the game has shifted in white's favor here. Apparently, rook to f8 would have been better, getting behind this pawn that is pushed forward on f5. So the game continues with white countering by pushing his own f-pawn, keeping space even. And that can be a strategy too. If your opponent is pushing pawns trying to gain space, you might be able to push your own pawns, blocking his space-gaining attempt and grabbing space, for yourself. And now we have a discovered attack on this bishop. So the bishops are traded off, and more space is gained, ignoring that trade for the moment because you're attacking the more valuable queen. So after capture, recapture, the queen must move, and now the queens are confronting one another. So what will be played here? Well, we have queen capturing the knight on h4, the best move in the position. So, interesting choice there. Allowing black to retreat his bishop and keep that light squared bishop, which is aimed down into the heart of white's king's position here. So, how will things continue? Well, we have the rook stepping forward, and, a good strategy is to bring a rook up into the game and maybe file the other rook in behind it. So you create a battery with these connected rooks, and that could be an attempt to target this f pawn, which cannot be protected by the other pawn, or else there'd be a capture and it would open up black's king side more. Although white's king side is open quite a bit as well. So the recommendation was what? Rook at A to D1, centralizing the other rook instead of bringing this rook forward. So things continue with this pawn pushing forward, the best move in the position. So that move is played anyway, protecting the pawn, but there's this option to capture here. And will that be played? Yes, we have a capture. The knight is under attack, so it drops back, targeting the pawn. And according to the computer, the game is still about even. White has just a slight edge. So the queen steps further up the board with a not quite a mate in one threat here, because the knight is covering that, but it is starting to look a little bit dangerous with these pawns. The queen, the rook could maybe try and get over on this open file at some point. Let's see how things go. We have a defensive move being played. The queen drops back, and a good piece of strategy is if the opponent places a piece on your side of the board, often you want to get rid of that piece as quickly as possible. You don't want your opponent's pieces setting up camp on your half of the board. So queen to g7 wasn't the best way to get rid of the queen. And apparently, rook to e7 would have been better, bringing that rook forward to help cover black's second rank there. So the game continues with a rook capture, an inaccuracy. Queen trades. Excuse me, the queen trade would have been better. So now we have knight capturing, the best move in the position. But at this point, white is the equivalent of one pawn ahead. Well, actually, he is a complete pawn ahead in material at this point. So the rooks grab the open file, a great piece of strategy there, where, if you can place one rook on an open file, that's usually decent. Placing two on the open file is a good piece of general strategy. Although, can this move be played here? Maybe not, because, if we have a trade up here and the queen ends up here, the knight can be captured. The computer preferred king up to h2, which, I don't know, that's kind of interesting, seeing as how the queen, well, I guess the queen can't check because of this rook. So the game continues with the rook move. A mistake, according to the computer. So what is recommended by the computer? It looks like knight to e5 first. Placing that knight on an outpost, maybe not the greatest outpost, because the pawn can chase that knight in the future. Although if it did it immediately, the knight could pick off this pawn. But that move would have been better, apparently, bringing that knight forward up into the action more. So the rook steps forward here. And, if we go back, apparently that's the best move. So I was thinking, can you trade everything down? You go here. Let's take a look at that. Capture. Rook captures. The other rook captures. Oh, the knight could always drop back and capture. All right. So the best move here. rook up to f6, where it's also backed up by the pawn and the other rook. The game continues with a queen trade. So not the best move. Rook trade, apparently a little bit better. And white's advantage is growing after the queens are off the board here. So we have capture, recapture. The knight is under attack. So the king defends the knight. And now the bishop repositions, targeting this unprotected pawn. And it looks like, okay, there's not a threat, of going here because the king can just capture and still protect that knight. But I don't know. It's looking a little bit rough here for black. So we have the rook defending the knight, and now check. Capture, bishop captures the other pawn, which that's a danger of strategically pushing your pawns too far forward where you're not able to defend them. And we saw how that pawn pushed so far forward that nothing was around to defend it, and then later in the endgame it's picked off. So, what do we have here? The king steps forward, and a great piece of general strategic advice is to get the king in the action in the endgame. As long as queens are off the board and there's not too many threats to the king, you probably need to get that king involved in the game. And another good piece of strategy is placing a rook on the 7th rank. If you can get 2 rooks on the 7th, that's even better usually. Why is it so good? Well, normally there's a lot of pawns still on the 7th rank here. You're targeting both of these pawns. So, defense could have been played, but that would be pretty passive. Instead, we have a counterattack. So the bishop attack is ignored in favor of this check. So a piece of strategy is, if you can ignore what your opponent is attempting to do with a more powerful counter threat, often that's a little bit better than just responding to your opponent's moves, if you can make more dangerous threats of your own. So the king steps forward, and now we have king up to f2 guarding that bishop. So the game continues with knight dropping back, and a blunder by Botvinnik here. Now, it's not a game-losing blunder, but he was almost winning, and now the game's quite a bit more even. He's just ahead by 1 pawn, and it could maybe still be drawable after this move. But what would have been best? Apparently, knight to f7. The computer prefers that. Now, I guess we could take a look at that. Why is that move so much better? Well, now they recommend knight down to f5, targeting the bishop. Then what? The bishop would just drop back. So something like that would have been maybe a little bit better for white. But we have this move, knight to e6. And so now knight maneuvering is taking place here. We have an attack on the bishop, and a good piece of strategical advice is, if you have pawns on both sides of the board in the end game, well, then that can favor a bishop over the knight. Here, we have pawns in the center and on the queen side, so it might not be as drastic of an advantage having the bishop versus the knight. But, bishops can move across the board much faster, and it's usually good to knock that bishop out if you can. So, knight drops back here, counter-targeting the opponent's bishop. So, instead of taking the bishop, which would have been a better move, we have this capture of the knight, capture, and the bishops stay on the board. And it's, why was this played? Well, opposite colored bishops can be drawn much more often. Why? Because you have one bishop covering all the light squares, the other one covering the dark squares, and they're kind of like ghosts. If you put your pieces on the opposite colored squares from your opponent's bishop, then that bishop roams around, not able to attack anything. So let's see how things continue. We have the pawn pushing forward, attacking this bishop. So after the bishop steps up, the game continues with a centralizing move, and that's a good piece of strategy. Centralize your pieces, because from there they can jump, all over the board in different directions much easier, as opposed to this bishop, which just has 2 diagonals, and the dark squared bishop for white has 4 different directions it can go, I guess, as opposed to 2 different directions. All right, so the game continues with a pawn push, and white pushes his pawn as well, leaving this diamond formation in the center. And so now we have a mistake, leading to a checkmate in 3. So a good piece of strategy is whenever the opponent's king is out in the open, look for ways to attack it. If it has limited number of squares, as black's king does here, definitely look for ways to target it. We have the rook cutting the king off from moving to the h-file. The king is preventing the opponent's king from moving forward, and this pawn is covering f5. So really, there are only, 2 squares that king can move to? And they just happen to be on the dark squares. So this bishop can cover those. So now we have the best move found, and this is where Smyslov resigns. Because whatever he does here, it looks like the rook can just move here and deliver a mate. Unless you go here and temporarily stop that, but then the rook can just drop back and capture and try and go there on the next move. So in light of those facts, it looks like Smyslov just resigned here. Apparently there's a mate in 2, and yes, the best move is to go rook to h8, but then you would just capture, and then on the next move you could go rook to h4, delivering the mate here. All right, well, I hope this was instructional and helped you. Feel free to leave comments, especially if there's something you'd like to request for future videos. Like and subscribe to support the channel if you haven't already. Thank you for watching, and have a super chess day.